Good afternoon, everyone. It's time to get started. Welcome to this webinar. This is one of the secrets from the Support Vault webinars. What we're talking about is standards. And when we talk about standards, we need to start with the base standard that we should all be fairly familiar with these days, and that's PDF. PDF, as all of you should know, was invented by Adobe a long time ago. But at some point, it was given away by Adobe, if you want to call it that, to the ISO or International Standards Organization. And there it got the very nice standard number ISO 32000. So today, if we work with PDF, PDF is a file format that is an active ISO standard. The development of the file format and new and upcoming versions of PDF, such as PDF 2.0, which is under development. That development is done by ISO, no longer by Adobe itself. Of course, Adobe is still part of that process through the ISO, but the ownership of PDF of the standard lies with the ISO organization. Now, when PDF was invented and started out in graphic arts, there was some kind of hope that PDF by itself would be enough to give us a more reliable workflow. And unfortunately, that is not the case. PDF by itself is not enough to get to a workflow where you can always reliably exchange files from one party to the other. And because of that, around 2001, actually probably beginning a little bit earlier, 99, 2000, in the US, there was a work effort that was then called PDFX1, and that was developed by, amongst other parties, DDAP, Digital Distribution of Advertising for Publishing. And they started thinking about a standard format to exchange advertisements from one party to another, typically from the people creating them to the publisher, using PDF. And that ended up being taken over by the ISO Standards Organization in 2001, and it became the PDFX standard. The X comes from blind exchange, what I mentioned before. If I'm the guy on the left, the creative person, and I want to have my stuff printed or published by someone at a publisher or printer, the concept behind PDFX is that I can make a PDFX document, send it to the next person in the line, and without having any communication, that person should be able to print what I made, and it should look exactly the same as what I created. So blind exchange. And this concept is really, really important to PDFX. And if you start thinking about why certain things are allowed or not allowed in PDFX, then always remember that this blind exchange concept is at the base of how PDFX came to be and how it was developed. And so typically you see that coming back in the decisions made in that standard. So there is this concept of blind exchange, and another way of looking at this, and we'll see this coming back a little bit later in the presentation. Another way of looking at this is with these dolls, and you surely know the concept. Each one fits in the other one, and we could look at PDF as the biggest one here, the one on the left, and then PDFX is a subset of PDF, so it's the doll that fits into the PDF doll if you want. Another way of putting this, every PDFX file is also a PDF file. So every file that is compliant to the PDFX standard necessarily is also or should also be compliant to the PDF standard. The other way around, of course, is not the case. It's not because I make a PDF file that I automatically also have a PDFX file. In fact, most PDF files out there, including probably 99% of what you find on the internet, is not PDFX, but simply some other form of PDF. Never ask a standards organization to create a standard, because if you ask them that, then they will not give you one standard, but a whole slew of standards. And this is exactly what happened with PDFX. What you see on the slide here is an overview of most of the PDFX flavors in existence today. And you don't have to remember all of them. In fact, some of them don't even exist anymore formally, such as pdfX2, which once was an ISO standard but has been retracted. You don't have to remember all of them. What I think you need to remember is these. These are the pdfX flavors that are really important. So the ones colored in orange, you should remember, because those are the ones that are actively used today or will be used in the very near future. pdfX1A, even though it's old, it dates back to 2001. Even if it's old, it is still the most actively used pdfX standard today. And pdfX4 is a little bit newer, and that is a standard that is the successor, if you want, of pdfX1A. We see that where people used to all be using pdfX1A 5 years ago, now there is a trend to move into pdfX4. And I will focus a lot more on these two and explain what the differences are and why this shift happens between the two formats. But those are important to know. The other two that are colored here, the ones in purple, I think you should remember at least, because they could be important. pdfX5N, because this is, of all the ISO standards we have today in pdfX, all the flavors we have today, it's the only one that deals with multi-channel workflows. So if you have a workflow that is based on CMYK plus light cyan, light magenta, or CMYK plus red, for some of these digital devices, then pdfX5N is a standard that caters to those types of workflows. And pdfX6, you should remember, even though it's not an ISO standard at the moment yet, but you still should remember it, because that's the next one coming up, and it will be the first pdfX flavor that is based on PDF 2.0, so the next major version of PDF. And as we go forward, maybe 3, 4, 5 years from now, the expectation is that pdfX6 and workflows based on PDF 2.0 will become more and more the norm. So pdfX6 is important from that point of view, but you're not going to encounter pdfX6 files anytime in the near future. So let's take a look at the two that I had in orange. pdfX1A, based on PDF 1.4. If you want to know, PDF 1.4 was the version of PDF that was invented to go together with Acrobat 5. So we're actually looking back quite a bit. The active revision of pdfX1A dates back to 2003. The original version was created in 2001. So we're looking at something that easily is 15 years old by now. And because it is based on PDF 1.4, which is a very old PDF format, it doesn't support a number of things that today we take for granted. For example, PDF 1.4 does not have support for transparency, live transparency. All transparency that you have in a PDF document needs to be flattened if you want to make a pdfX 1A file. PDF 1.4 didn't know the concepts of optional content groups, what we commonly refer to as layers. So those are not allowed in pdfX1A files either. It doesn't support JPEG 2000 and a number of other modern compression techniques for PDF. So the PDFX1A standard is limited already just because it is based on PDF 1.4, and as such, it cannot use features that are newer than PDF 1.4. The second big limitation, but that is not a limitation of the PDF 1.4 format, but of PDFX1A itself. The second big limitation is that in a PDFX1A file, you can only have gray CMYK and spot color. Now, gray perhaps shouldn't be mentioned separately because it's basically CMYK where you only use the black plate. Um, but only those color spaces are supported. So in a PDFX1A file, you cannot have LAB colors, you cannot have RGB, only CMYK and spot color. And that is, of course, a serious restriction, but at the same time, because of this, it means that you get a very predictable file format. And that is undoubtedly why PDFX1A is still very popular in modern workflows because it's very predictable. And we've been used to work with this over for at least 15 years. We know how to deal with it. Software knows how to deal with it. RIPs know how to deal with it. So it's a very predictable and reliable file format. Opposed to that, PDFX4. PDFX4 is based on PDF 1.6, which is a little bit of a more modern PDF format. Let's not get overly excited. PDF 1.6 was invented for Acrobat 7. That's still very old software, but it is more modern than PDF 1.4. And very crucially, it allowed a number of things that were not allowed in the earlier formats. And again, the most important ones are listed there: transparency, these optional content groups or layers, and JPEG 2000. And it also, so that's one big difference. And it also, in PDFX4, the ISO committee took the decision that they were going to allow other color spaces than CMYK and spot color. In fact, in a PDFX4 file, you can have any color space that is defined in the PDF standard as long as it is used in a correctly color managed way. So if I have a CMYK PDFX4 file, I can include RGB images in that file as long as the RGB image is properly color managed. And that means it needs to have an ICC profile attached to it. So that is allowed in PDFX4. And because of this wider acceptance of different color spaces and the fact that it also supports live transparency and these other more modern features, PDF features, there are a lot more possibilities in PDFX4. Of course, the flip side of more possibilities is that it means that RIPs that print PDFX4 files or workflow applications or imposition applications or anything that works with PDF documents in your workflow also needs to handle these more modern features in a correct way. And if you're asking why it took so long to start this transition from PDFX1A to PDFX4, then it is exactly because of the restrictions in PDFX1A that make it so easy to deal with and predictable, and the higher level of capabilities that you have in PDFX4 that also mean you have to have updated software and hardware to deal with these newer features. But those are the two ISO PDFX standards that you should remember: PDFX1A and PDFX4, knowing that PDFX1A is still the most used standard today, but that PDFX4 offers a lot more capabilities in terms of workflow, and that those two are the ones that we will be using and talking about for probably, if I would have to guess, 3 to 5 years from now. After that, we'll probably be talking about PDFX 6 and PDF 2.0 based workflows. But for the next couple of years, this is what you're going to see in the graphic arts landscape. Okay, so that's nice from the ISO point of view and PDFX point of view, but let's take a look at around the same time period, actually, starting in 2000, 2001. And at the time, I worked at a small software company based out of Ghent and Focus, and we made Preflight software. And in the beginning of 2001, we started having conversations with initially people from Belgium, some of the national organizations, graphic arts organizations in Belgium, who came to us and said, so we're thinking about doing exchange of advertisements based on PDF, but we think that we need some rules. And can you help us to think about the rules for advertisements in PDF? Now, this sounds suspiciously similar to the story I told about DDAP in the US and what happened to become PDFX at a later date. But I think what was a little bit different in this case is that the discussion wasn't only about advertisement. We also started talking to Fibelgra in Belgium, which is the organization that deals with commercial print. So we had different market segments that sat around the table. Very shortly after that, we got more or less the same question from the Netherlands, where you also have national standards organizations who were thinking about standardizing on PDF for different workflows. And coincidentally, a couple of months after that, and this is all, I have dates on here, but it's a little bit fluid, of course, when all of this happened, but about the same time period, we started having the same conversation with people from France that wanted to do more or less the same thing. And what became clear very, very quickly is that while we could talk to all of these people individually, you probably don't want to end up in a situation where each European country has their own delivery standard for advertisements or for commercial print work. We live in a European context, so people who create advertisements in Belgium happen to also print them in France or in the Netherlands, and vice versa. So it made sense to bring these people together and start talking about this in a bigger context. And that is what in June 2002 became the Ghent Workgroup. What you see on there, and excuse my poor knowledge of geography because I'm missing some islands here and there, and I think I'm actually missing part of Denmark. No harm intended in all of that. But what you saw happening is that from a number of European countries, the representatives of the national organizations that dealt with commercial print and magazine and newspaper ads, mostly those um, market segments, came together and, as the Ghent Workgroup, started thinking about what do we need in our workflows. The mission statement that the Ghent Workgroup started with, and that it still has today, was that it was an organization that wanted to establish and disseminate process specifications for best practices in graphic arts workflows. What that meant, that was, on the one hand, it was an organization that created specifications or standards. We did not call them standards because the Ghent Workgroup is not an officially accredited standards organization like ISO. But specifications are standards. We created those, and at the same time, we also spent our time and effort on making sure that people were aware of these specifications and that they used them. So there is this educational part to the Ghent Workgroup as well. And you still see that today. We spend a lot of time discussing in very technical subcommittees how standards should look like, but we also spend a lot of time educating people on how to use standards. So that Ghent Workgroup organization was formed. And it started working on more or less the same things as what DDAP and later ISO was working on with PDFX. So it's very reasonable to then at some point ask the question, hold on, if we have the US and part of Europe, and mostly the German speaking part of Europe, if the US and the German speaking part of Europe are leaning towards PDFX, and then you have another bunch of countries that have united themselves, if you want, in the umbrella of the Ghent Workgroup and are working on their own set of specifications, isn't this going to lead to a situation where you have two standards that conflict? And it did look like that at some point, and I still think that one of the wisest things we did at the Ghent Workgroup very early on was to decide that that was not going to be smart. And actually, if you looked at the work of these two organizations, it was very, very clear that they could coexist quite nicely. If you look at the ISO organization, that's always been a slower organization, more theoretical, more vendor driven, and also more accurate. That's kind of the result of these previous points. Slow in the context of standards development is not necessarily a bad thing. It means that uh, things are thought through and that you put in a lot of time in figuring out what the correct concept is and how you're going to document that and how it has to be described in the standard for everyone to do exactly the same thing worldwide. So that's a very basic quality of the ISO organization. On the other hand, in the Ghent Workgroup, we were able to move faster and we had to move faster because we wanted to create something that in a very short term would be practically usable. If I talk about PDFX6 today, I'm basically telling you that you're not going to be able to practically use it until 5 years from now. That's realistically what timescales on an ISO level look like. What we did in the Ghent Workgroup was come up with specifications today that were useful tomorrow. And that has downsides, of course. The upside is that you have something tomorrow. The downside is that you weren't able to think that long about how are we going to write this down and um, is what we write down actually accurate so that different people can implement it and the result is going to be the same. So it's not that one or the other is better, but they are very different approaches. And the other difference, and this is the key point here on this slide, is that what ISO set out to do was to develop a global graphic arts standard. They wanted to develop minimum quality guidelines for PDF used in a PDF workflow. And that's not at all what the Ghent Workgroup wanted to do. What the Ghent Workgroup said was, no, we have people from different market segments. And what we should do is we should be able to give them guidelines, specifications for each of these different market segments. Having one global standard is not going to cut it. An advertisement in magazine print might have and has different needs and requirements than that same advertisement used in newspaper. So the Ghent Group from the very start wanted to diversify for specific markets. Let's go back to the doll slide. What that means is that the Ghent Group said, instead of reinventing the wheel, what we're going to do is we're going to base all of the specifications we develop on the PDFX standard, which by itself, as we saw, is built on top of the PDF standard. Yeah? And then if you take that a little bit further in the other direction of the workflow, then a printer can then say, oh, I'm going to use a Ghent Workgroup specification, but I'm going to add workflow specific requirements on top of that. So you really have this graduated um, lineup of standards, if you want, from very generic on the left-hand side where you have the PDF standard to limited to graphic arts community with pdfX, to limited to specific market segments if you look at the Ghent Workgroup specifications, and then limited to or specific to a particular printer or a particular workflow at a printer. And all of these fit nicely together. And by doing this, it meant that the Ghent Workgroup was no longer or not at all in competition with ISO or the pdfX standard. Rather, it could simply build on the work that ISO was doing and develop Ghent Workgroup standards that were based on pdfX standards. And we'll see that come back when we talk about the different specification versions that we have in Ghent Workgroup. Now, why is this possible and why is there such a difference between these two? This slide gives another way to look at it. What you see here is a number of potential problems in print workflows when PDF is involved. And for each of them, there is an indication of whether the pdfX standard is able to do something about that particular problem, whether it's able to detect that particular problem or not. And on the right-hand side, you see whether the Ghent Workgroup specifications are able to detect that problem or not. And you can see that there is a lot more red in the line under, or in the column rather, under pdfX than under the Ghent Workgroup. I'll take one of these items as an example, the same one I always use, and that's resolution. If I am writing a pdfX standard, I really can't say anything about image resolution. Why? Well, my pdfX standard needs to be applicable to an advertisement for a high-end glossy magazine, but it also needs to cover a workflow where I'm printing billboards at the side of a highway. The glossy magazine side, I might require 300 dpi as minimum image resolution to get the quality standards that I require. On the billboard side, I might need 30 dpi, maybe 15, and it will still be good enough because this is a huge billboard that sits next to the highway. And people are only going to see it in a moving car and it's going to be far away. So you don't need to have high resolution. So pdfX as a global standard is not able to say anything about image resolution because it's too diverse across this huge field of graphic arts. The Ghent Workgroup, on the other hand, is able to say, oh, but this is the flavor that we have for magazine ads. And in magazine ads, we are going to require 150 dpi minimum. And for billboards, we're going to say something completely different. But because they go into different market segments, they can have rules for image resolution or for total ink coverage that is possible, overprint problems, all of these things that are specific and could be different for different markets can actually be addressed by the Ghent Workgroup. So there is one pdfX1a standard, but if you look at the Ghent Workgroup website and you would look at the documentation on variants, or if you look at the Preflight profiles that you have in applications such as pdfToolbox, then you're going to see a range of profiles because different market segments have different profiles. So let's talk about versions. And you will see that the versions that you have in the Ghent Workgroup specifications, well, kind of mimic the pdfX versions or go along with the pdfX versions. And that is not coincidental, of course. As I said, the Ghent Workgroup tries to build on top of the work that the ISO is doing with pdfX. So we're actually reusing those. Again, there are probably two versions of, well, not probably, there are two versions of the Ghent Workgroup specifications that you should remember and use. And that is 1v4, that is the oldest one, and then I will talk about 2015 specification, that's the second one. But let's start with the oldest one, 1v4. The naming convention at that point came from, the one comes from PDFX1A. The fact that this particular specification is built on the PDFX1A standard. And the V4 was the version of that specification. So this was the fourth version of the specification built on PDFX1A. And Workgroup is very smart when it comes to technical stuff, maybe not so smart when it comes to naming conventions, but anyway. So this is the oldest Ghent Workgroup standard, but it's also just very similar to the story I told about PDFX1A still being a very active standard today, even though it's old. These 1v4 specifications are still used in the majority of the workflows today. And if you would look at what national organizations, printer organization or publisher organizations in countries would advise you to use, then in many cases they will have something that is either the Ghent Workgroup 1v4 specification or something that closely resembles that. So used a lot based on the very conservative PDFX1A standard, very widely accepted throughout the industry. At some point, the Ghent Workgroup started thinking, well, this is not a very modern standard. Something that is built on a PDFX standard that is 15-year-old is not a very modern standard. And you can you can start to see problems with that PDFX1A standard because, for example, of the transparency flattening. Doing transparency flattening is a very, very difficult thing. The algorithms are difficult, and it's very easy to get results that are not exactly 100% what you would want. The files become more complex. There are some problems with fine white lines being printed or visible on screen because of transparency flattening. So it's a very invasive thing to do to a document. And the fact that PDFX1A requires that, well, started to be a problem at some point. So the Ghent Workgroup developed what was called the 2012 specifications. They were used quite a bit for testing, but virtually not used in production. The only exception there was Switzerland, and Switzerland didn't exactly use the 2012 specification, but Switzerland was very smart and developed something that was called PDFX Ready specifications that were based on a lot of the work done in the Ghent Workgroup for the 2012 specifications, but with some exceptions. The good thing about these 2012 specifications were that they were based on PDFX4, so on the more modern ISO standard. And as such, they didn't require transparency flattening anymore, and so on and so on. And they were a version of the Ghent Workgroup specs that were used a lot for testing and making sure that well, something based on PDFX4 was going to be viable, that the software was up to it, that the hardware was up to it. Having said all of this, you can forget about these 2012 specifications. You will not find them under the application settings on the Ghent Workgroup website, for example. What you should remember is the 2015 specifications because those are more modern. They differ from 2012 in some minor details, but very important details, and they have been tested extensively and are in the process of being used in real life. In the Netherlands, for example, there is a gradual change from requiring 1v4 to requiring 2015 specifications. And 1v4 is not going to disappear all of a sudden, but they are clearly pushing to using these 2015 specifications. And I'll tell you in a second why that is as well and what the differences between those two are. So on this slide, remember that there is something that is called 1v4 and that is a little bit older, but might actually be what people will tell you to use today. Also remember that there is something called 2015, which is more modern, which is built on PDFX4, and which is probably the upcoming version of the Ghent Workgroup standard that you are going to see deployed more and more in the coming years. So what's so special about this 2015 one? What is new about it? Well, in the 1v4 specification, we have virtually the same story as in PDFX1A. We have to because it's based on that. And in there, we only support spot color and we support CMYK. In the 2015 specifications, it is still possible to work in that kind of environment. In the 2015 specifications, you'll find pre-flight profiles, for example, that are called CMYK only, and then pre-flight profiles that are called CMYK plus RGB. The ones that are called CMYK only allow spot color and CMYK colors. They are still based on PDFX4, so um, that means that they still allow live transparency and all the other modern features, but in terms of color spaces, it has been restricted to spot color and CMYK, and that makes for a little bit of an easier transition in some cases. If you use the pre-flight profiles that are called CMYK plus RGB, you're dealing with the other side of the spectrum, and in that scenario, in that world, what is allowed is spot color, CMYK, and then a little bit misleading, it has an RGB icon on there, but actually other color managed color spaces. And there are a few more rules. It is not that RGB in general is allowed. So if you have a file that is compliant to the 2015 specs from the Ghent Workgroup, the text and the line art in that file, for example, still has to be in either gray, CMYK, or spot color. But the images in that file can have also ICC-based RGB or LAB, so color managed color spaces. There is a very clear reason that we did this, and the reason is that once you also allow text and line art to be RGB, you end up with all kinds of very ugly problems with separation and how do you do that and how does that gets printed afterwards, and if it's black text but it's set in RGB black, what happens when that is then color converted to CMYK in order to be printed? Do you end up with color on all four separations? And in order to avoid that, text and line art always has to be CMYK or spot. But for images where you might want to do late binding, for example, meaning I don't want to choose what output device I'm going to use until the last minute. And then I might decide to go to digital or to offset. And I want to be able to use the larger gamut that I have on a digital device if I choose for digital. For those kinds of scenarios, the fact that you can specify images as ICC-based RGB or as LAB is very important. So this is a compromise between allowing more things, yet at the same time trying to not make the file format so complex that it is impossible to deal with from a color management point of view. So that as far as color is concerned. If you look at file sizes, there are a few changes between the 1v4 and the 2015 specifications, and most of them have to do with the fact that we're dealing with a more modern file based on pdfX4. pdfX4 allows things like JPEG 2000, which is a compression mechanism for images that can give you smaller images that are still higher quality than what traditional JPEG compression can give you. But also what you will see is that because files don't have to be transparency flattened, they tend to be less complex, and thus they tend to be smaller than a comparable file that would be based on PDFX1A. So When you look at file sizes, there will be some differences between the 1v4 and the 2015 specification. When you look at optional content groups or layers, then those are allowed in the 2015 specifications. And those are mainly allowed because it opens up new avenues in workflows. It means that when you have a file that has to contain different language versions, for example, or different geographical variants of a publication, that it is possible to insert all of that in the same file using layers. And if you start taking this a few steps further and you start thinking about large format workflows and packaging workflows, then of course the use of layers becomes even more interesting. And there was very recently we had in ISO an approved ISO standard for the standardization of the names and metadata associated with layers to make life and packaging workflows easier. And that's why these are also allowed in the 2015 specifications, because we start seeing workflows where these optional content groups or layers are used for all kinds of workflow scenarios. The next change, although it's a smaller one, has to do with ink coverage. The 1v4 standard was out for a long time, and it gave us a lot of experimental data on what works and what doesn't work, what kind of problems do we get back from the field. And as a result, in the 2015 specification, some of the allowed ink values have been fine-tuned, but those changes are not very high. The bigger change is that in the 2015 specifications, we actually have good algorithms for the Preflight tools. So we demand that Preflight tools do a proper ink coverage check. There, where in 1v4, the only thing that the Ghent Workgroup said was that ink coverages or ink levels for individual objects had to be checked. Why? Well, 1v4 dates back at least 10 years and probably closer to 15 when you look at the origin of the Ghent Group specifications, and the software simply wasn't fast enough and capable enough to do a good ink coverage calculation back in those days. Right now, all of the modern pre-flight software is capable of doing this kind of calculation to a high degree of reliability across a whole page. So it doesn't look at individual objects, rather it will look at the rendered version of the page and tell you where too much ink is being used. So not too big of a difference in terms of ink limits that are allowed between 1v4 and 2015, but it could be a significant difference in what is being reported simply because of the fact that in 2015 pre-flight tools have gotten better and there is now a better check. When you look at other differences between these specifications, then you can see some of them listed here, but most of these are not that important because many of these features are not typically used yet in production files. So you can natively include OpenType fonts in a PDF 1.6 file. But there are not that many applications that can actually create a PDF that includes one. Same with 16-bit images, same with ICC Profile version 4. Those are all upcoming technologies that you might see more in the future, but today aren't spotted that often in the wild yet. And the expectation is that by the time that these files are actually being generated by software, RIPS and workflow software should be able to deal with them quite nicely. Before I do the summary, I have one thing that I'm going to show you still. So let me quit this and go to pdfToolbox. The only thing I want to show you is where you find these profiles. And that's actually not very difficult. If you go to Tools and then Profiles, in the list of libraries, you have two places where you find standards profiles. One is in a library called PDF Standards, and there you find all of the ISO standard profiles. So not just for PDFX, but also for PDFA, PDFUA, which is universal accessibility, PDFE for engineering, PDFVT for variable and transactional. So here you see the support for all of the ISO standards based on PDF, not just PDFX. And then if you go to prepress color and transparency, you will also find the PDFX profiles in there. On the one hand, profiles that will try to convert to a PDFX file. On the other hand, profiles that test compliancy with PDFX. But there you also have a prepress section. And in that prepress section, you find profiles based on the Ghent Workgroup standard. And starting with pdfToolbox 10, I'm actually not 100% sure for pdfToolbox 9, but certainly starting for pdfToolbox 10, what you find in there are specifications that are based on the 2015 specification of the Ghent Workgroup. So there's really no need to go to the Ghent Workgroup website and download stuff from there in order to be compliant or generate files that are compliant or test compliancy. You can simply go to the prepress color and transparency library and you have the Ghent Workgroup profiles in the list already, same as the profiles from PDFX that are in that list. Yeah. So a little bit of summary on the presentation, and I will also leave the last slide of the presentation on there, which gives you my email address in case there are any follow-up questions about this. A little bit of a summary. What we looked at is the ISO standard, history of the ISO standards, and specifically the two that you should remember because they are used so much, and that is PDFX1A and PDFX4. And you can think of them as the old standard that doesn't allow anything and the new standard that allows almost everything. That would be PDFX1A and PDFX4 in that order. And then you can also, we also talked about the Ghent Workgroup specifications, and in the Ghent Workgroup specifications, I talked about three of them, but I told you to remember only two. The first one is 1v4, and that's the one that you still see used today in many graphic arts workflows. The second one is 2015, and that is the upcoming one based on PDFX4, allowing all of those modern PDFX4 features that we talked about, also allowing color managed RGB or LAB images so that you can take advantage of wider gamut devices and so on. Those are the two that are being used today, and those are the two that you should remember and use yourself if you want to do anything in graphic arts. And let me show you perhaps if I can, and that's a nice way of closing it down. And so far I can see no questions, so either I did a good job or I confused you enough that you don't dare to ask questions anymore. But if I go to what do I want to show you, to application settings, this is the Ghent Workgroup website. If I go to application settings, you'll see that there are two versions of the specification that are highlighted here. The first one is this 1v4. They're actually in the opposite order because we want people to move to 2015. So you have the GWG 1v4 specifications, you have the GWG 2015 specifications, and then if you would look at pdfToolbox, for example, it will give you a nice download file, and basically what that download file would give you is a document that says you should not have downloaded this. It's already in the application, and it will show you where in the application you will find this. But also for other applications like InDesign or Illustrator or Quark Express, you have a way of downloading output PDF output settings, and these output settings for Quark Express or InDesign will give you a PDF file that is as close as possible to what is required by the Ghent Workgroup specifications. So if you're thinking about using Ghent Workgroup specs, don't forget that there are also application settings for other applications that you can download for free, of course, from the Ghent Workgroup website, and that you can use to create good PDF files, and that hopefully will give you less errors afterwards during pre-flight. And while I'm here, and I will stop in 2 seconds, but while I'm here, let me also point out that we have something that is called test suites on this website, and that there the most important one is this Ghent PDF output suite. The Ghent PDF output suite you can use to validate whether your workflow or your RIP is able to cope with these PDFX4 files that you want to use, for example. So that will give you, there's a lot of documentation in there. It's actually very straightforward to use, but that will give you a number of PDF files that you can simply print or process through a workflow. And if they are processed correctly, you'll see that very nicely. If not, there will be big X's that appear over certain areas of these patches, and you can check then the documentation to see what that means and what is not supported. And as an ending line, usually it's not that these things are not supported by today's RIPs and workflow applications. It is usually that those applications or RIPs are not configured correctly. Um, and then you can refer to the instructions that a number of different vendors publish, instructions on how to configure particular RIPs or particular applications in order to properly process PDFX4 files, for example. Yeah. So don't forget the theory, but also don't forget that there is a site like the Ghent Workgroup website where you can download a lot of the application settings and support documents, and that in pdfToolbox you already have these profiles built in, and that they are very good profiles to start from. For example, if you don't know what to do in terms of pre-flight, you have no idea what the customer wants, use the sheet-fed offset CMYK profile. That's probably the most generic one, and it's an excellent base for any other profile that you would want to make. So in case of doubt, use one of these Ghent Workgroup profiles, and preferably, uh, or well, specifically this sheet-fed offset one is a very nice one if you have no further details to go on. That was it from my side. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much for staying until the very end. This was a webinar with lots of numbers and different versions and so on, so it can be a little bit confusing at times. The only thing that I'm left with is to wish you a very nice rest of the day. Goodbye.